So I wanted to start with a quote from Marilynne Robinson, who is the author of the deeply religious novels, Gilead, Home and Housekeeping. She points to the persistence of the subjective, even in a world that is always attempting to remove it, in order to find the objective, impersonal, unbiased place. And she says the difficulty with which objectivity can be achieved, to the extent that it is ever achieved, only demonstrates the pervasive importance of subjectivity. So she goes on to say, to the great degree that theology has accommodated the parascientific worldview, it too has tended to forget the beauty and strangeness of the individual soul. That is, of the world as perceived in the course of a human life, of the mind as it exists in time. But the beauty and strangeness persists just the same. And theology persists, even when it has absorbed as truth theories and interpretations that could reasonably be expected to kill it off. So that's just the beginning. But for a long time, I've been pondering the problem of evidence and what counts as evidence, and about authorities and who counts, and about how what is so distinctive about us is our inwardness, our subjectivity, but then how little there is of this, of that in the scientific endeavor these days, and how I think the pandemic has exacerbated this inward-outward divide, somewhat dislocating us. And I listened to the very erudite talk last week, and I'm afraid this is more in the way of ruminations and ponderings, which I hope to share with you. And I found this year to be very disconcerting, as I'm sure many of you have, and I know you think that someone in New Zealand has nothing to complain about. But it certainly is sapping of energy, and all the rituals of everyday life have been lost. But I know that everywhere else has been worse. But we hear so much about science in the news now. We are told that our politicians are following the science, and virologists and epidemiologists have become the flavor of the month. But what happens when human tragedy and science combine? Science is becoming more hardline. Science is becoming politicized. And in this process, the subjectivity, which is always on the edges of science, is taking a back seat. On the other hand, subjectivity is always central for faith. We take our religious experience seriously. And the Bible is full of people making inferences that are in no way scientific. So I've often wondered how we bridge that increasing gap. In a time of crisis, we need to bridge the gap even more. We need to understand and find meaning in the virus, as well as understanding its objective workings. We need to understand how people experience the pandemic and how it is changing our expectations and the social contract. All of this is related to evidence. As humans, we glean meaning and patterns and knowledge from our subjectivity, as well as in our newer, more objective methods. So I'm going to look at all of this under 3 questions or lenses. The first is to look at this ubiquitous term, there is no evidence for so-and-so, and what that really means. The second is looking at the sheer number of contradictions and reversals in what is said to be effective in the last 6 months. And the third is the discounting of everyday experience that accompanies the increasing emphasis on scientific evidence. In the end, I will think about some of the challenges all of this raises for science integrating with faith. But before I start, I should say also that what we do know in an objective, highly technical way about this virus is staggering. We know its DNA before it really even left China. Its shape, its form is ubiquitous in our daily reading. We know how it is changing. We can work out who got it from whom. We have turned its shape and dynamics through supercomputers and retrieved ideas for remedies. Vaccines have been put onto speed dial, and trials are proceeding. And all of this is truly awesome and could not happen without worldwide cooperation and the system as it is. But the pandemic has placed many of the questions I was talking about of inwardness and objectivity into high relief. And so the first question I want to look at is the thing about there is no evidence for so-and-so. And I've never heard so often this phrase uttered. And one hears that in a clinical setting and also in the newspapers, but especially in public health announcements regarding evidence for the effectiveness of measures taken against the coronavirus. But what does it mean? It sometimes is really code for this process or substance is of enormous interest. Many people think it is effective. There is anecdotal evidence, but it hasn't gone through some very specific trials. In other words, sometimes it means that there really is evidence, but the evidence doesn't count. And in particular, the evidence which doesn't count is often culturally tied, or it is first-person accounts. And at other times, of course, it means that there really isn't any evidence, and perhaps there is evidence that it could be harmful, like using bleach to cure the virus. But what there is no evidence means is that there is only one sort of result that matters, the outcomes of double-blind peer-reviewed trials. There is no evidence that sets cognitive and practical boundaries around a claim. But sometimes it acts also a little like Schrodinger's cat, as though really something is suspended as really effective or ineffective, depending on our knowledge in this very particular way. Whereas, of course, that isn't the case. It was said often about masks. And yet, there were all sorts of evidence for mask use, the success of Asian countries in countering the virus, where almost universal mask use was in place, and the common sense evidence that a barrier might give some protection. It was said around the spread of the virus by surfaces and less by droplets in the air, even though it was always hard to imagine that droplets really only came in certain sizes which dropped conveniently to the ground, unlike flu. It was said about music and singing. First, that there were reports of widespread illness from one choir, and then scientists decided it must have been from their social gatherings before or after, even though you have only to sit close to a person singing flat out to think that there could well be a problem with singing. So there is no evidence acts to diminish and discourage ordinary observation and ordinary everyday experience. It tends to identify evidence as only of one kind, much as a statement of faith in the church setting will allow only one expression of Christian faith. So much depends on what we mean by evidence. And I am very grateful for the double-blind studies and the extraction of evidence at that level, and the extreme care needed in the development of vaccines. Our faith does tell us that as humans, we have a tendency to be blind, and this kind of impartial knowledge is one test against that kind of bias. That is, if there is no fraud or carelessness in the experiments, or the data gathering or the analysis. And I'm grateful for all we know so quickly and for the vaccines that are all but ready. But consider everyday life. In everyday human and animal life, there are multiple forms of evidence. There are some things we know to be true with that double-blind level of certainty. And then there are all sorts of other propositions and hunches we believe on the basis of trusting an authority or the trust of a person. We trust family and friends with our lives and without any kind of double-blind evidence. Double-blind evidence would undermine personal trust. And hunches and anecdotal evidence often become the basis of the next scientific trial. I used to do mathematics, and in maths, it was always the working that mattered to the observer or the examiner. But the real magic of mathematics was the intuitive leap that happens first and was only later justified. Similarly, we often downplay these leaps in science. We believe things because they work for us, or because we have seen them work for enough other people. Even in medicine, there is a lower level of certainty, but nevertheless evidence found in retrospective trials. There is evidence that a drug might work on the basis of logic and chemistry and the geometry of viruses. There's evidence that is inferred by taking a long view or a more holistic view. Evidence in a court of law does depend heavily on critical appraisal of testimony. So like the pots on the stove, some evidence is upfront and almost certain, but sometimes limited in scope. Whereas other evidence sits further back, bubbling away, and we consider it probable, but not firmly decided. And for each level of evidence, we make decisions about harm versus good that might be done if we stake our lives or our health on that evidence. But even with evidence that has gone through double-blind trials, there are always stray variables that may be unaccounted for. A drug might work in one population but not another. It might work with one gender but not another, one age group but not another. Side effects might only emerge after many years. The world simply does not divide up into things that work and are true, and for which there is scientific evidence, and the things which don't work and are not true, and for which there is evidence they don't work. The grey zone is huge, and evidence is multifaceted. And then there is a whole world of so-called alternative medicine out there, which really only is alternative in approaching healing from a different lens. Many so-called integrative approaches to healing are not completely without evidence. Sometimes they are looking at different evidence, or they are the result of long and sometimes ancient practices, much like prayer. We don't know why meditation, Reiki, and acupuncture work for some people, and I don't mean about the virus, I mean for other reasons, but not others. But we are learning an awful lot about the variability of human genomes. And it isn't surprising that some things work for some people and not for others. Some alternatives do take account of human individuality in a way that a more universal approach does not. So I would say that science is messy and complex and incomplete. It is the best way we have of getting results for millions of people quickly, but it is not perfect. And in the breathless rush of new information and new drugs and new vaccines, we can't help thinking that there is now only one kind of evidence in the world, and that is the double-blind peer-reviewed trial. Everything else is null and void. That makes any conversation between science and faith more complex and more fraught. Faith never has that kind of double-blind evidence, and faith is often on a pot bubbling away at the edges of our experience. And yet we stake our lives and our reputations on this much less rigid form of evidence. So this refrain, "there is no evidence for," is certainly not new. And I spend a lot of time pondering evidence in everyday life. But the pandemic has certainly heightened the stakes. And I'd like to end this section with a little historical tale from New England in the 18th century. The small Boston settlement had been ravaged by successive smallpox infections. And in 1721, there was yet another smallpox epidemic sweeping through the settlement. Cotton Mather, the fearsome Puritan religious leader in Boston, was nevertheless open to evidence of various kinds. And one of his slaves, Onesimus from West Africa, brought him news of a new way of tackling smallpox. He told Mather how they would use little amounts of the live pus, break the skin and smear it on. Mather persuaded one of the doctors, Zabdiel Boyston, to try it, and 248 people in the settlement, including Mather's own son, were vaccinated. And of that number, only 3% died, as opposed to more than 14% who weren't. But Mather received vitriol and death threats for the experiment, which was bold. His critics included the only medical doctor with a degree in the colony, who argued that there was no evidence. In that case, being open to less than certain evidence and the evidence of first-hand accounts from other countries saved lives. But the practice, which was ironically brought to the civilized New England town from darkest Africa, had been used in China as far back as 1000 BC. And this new method was not completely random. it emerged in different parts of the world as people observed that people who had once survived the disease did not get it again. So I just wanted to stop there after this section and see if anyone has any thoughts or reactions or questions.
Thank you, Nicola. As you were speaking there, I was thinking about how I've got this real sense that people are going to be very, very nervous about this COVID vaccine when it arrives. And I think I read in Maternity News there was even a medical professional who was saying that he wouldn't trust or he wouldn't vaccinate with a new COVID vaccine because it was going to be pushed along a bit too quickly. And of course, there's a whole group of anti-vaxxers out there anyway. Do you get that sense too that we're going to need a lot more convincing for this vaccine than any other we've had in the past?
Yeah, well, it comes up in a bad time in vaccination history, doesn't it? I mean, yes, I think so. And especially as it's only going to be claiming to be about 50% effective anyway. So, you know, that I think that a lot of people are going to be waiting and seeing and not wanting to be perhaps on the front line of that.
Yeah. If I could ask Jeff to unmute himself. He's got a question. Can you ask your question to Nicola, please? Jeff? Sorry, is it Stephanie? Sorry, it says a different name in the chat. I see the surname's the same. Is it Stephanie? Have you got a question?
No, it was me, Jennifer. I'm with Jeff.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Jennifer, would you like to ask your question to Nicola?
Nicola, it just occurred to me listening to you that the level of evidence required in any decision making depends on a number of factors, like how extreme the situation is, what are the losses that are going to happen with different decisions, and how many people are implicated in the decision. So that the emphasis on the double-blind peer-reviewed trial would be by people who are answerable, likely to come before a royal commission or something like that.
No, I agree, and I agree that there are all sorts of constraints in the medical profession on the way in which they can do trials or they can prescribe medicine and so on. So yes, I agree that there are those sorts of constraints that do change the way in which people are going to be acting. And so it's not just a matter of not using first person, of not being willing to trust the first person account. But I do think that training and that understanding that only a certain kind of evidence matters does transfer over into the way in which physicians actually approach medicine, nevertheless, so that it becomes an inward thing as well as just something that they have to do. I mean, I myself, for example, my first child had a severe reaction to his first vaccinations, which were at 3 months in the US, and he went suddenly very, very limp, and his fontanelle was raised. And I remember going to the hospital, and he was beginning to get better, but the young doctor sort of sat there and said to me, perhaps his fontanelle is always raised. And I mean, at that point, I sort of lost all confidence in this doctor because, of course, I got up every morning and I knew exactly what this child looked like. And I knew exactly how he was and that he wasn't limp and unresponsive. And it's that kind of experience that I think is quite common. And now I did go back and had more vaccinations, but I can sort of understand why people do get put off, in a sense, when they experience this kind of thing. And this, of course, was the US, where you have people who are extremely worried about any kind of liability. And so there's an extra sort of motivation really to try and explain this experience away, I think.
Yeah, I actually had the opposite experience.
तो ये गेट से घुसते ही पहला मकान है कोने वाला, पता होगा उसको.
Sorry, I think somebody's forgot to put mute on. Yeah, I had a similar experience. My youngest son stopped breathing after his 18-month vaccination, but I had the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne all over me, wanting to, take it really seriously. So I was quite impressed with that. Yeah. Stephen, would you like to unmute and ask this question, and then we might get Nicola to move on.
It's actually Philippa sitting next to Stephen.
Oh, sorry, it's just the names I see.
I realised that I would use Stephen's computer. Look, just listening to it, I'm absolutely loving it. But and I think you're identifying something that's really poignant. But it struck me: how do you distinguish between instinct and a good guess?
Well, I think you have to then go on and test it in various ways, wherever it comes from. And instincts always have to be tested, and so do good guesses. You can't just have them and just assume that it's going to be right. But I think there's a difference between testing your good guesses and your hunches, and just rejecting them because that's all they are. So yes, I think we have to have a combination of some sort of more objective tests plus the subjectivity, but that it's important not to reject the subjective first-hand experience. So for example, I would have been more happy if the doctor that I had encountered had taken it seriously as Sarah's did, and then that they might have taken the next one seriously and the next one. But instead, I saw the doctor already explaining away what was in front of his eyes, and therefore I wasn't very impressed by that. Yeah.
Well, there's a few more questions, but I think I'll ask you.
I'm happy to do them.
Okay, all right. Sophie, would you like to? I'm really cognizant that I might be reading out the wrong name, because people do use their partners and siblings, computers. So it just says from Sophie.
This is me.
Great.
Thank you for a great beginning to this fascinating conversation. I am a medical practitioner, and I think one of the temptations in clinical practice is when you are asked a question that you do not know the answer to, or that you think you know the answer to. And you certainly might think you know it better than the patient. To rely upon authority and then to use the phrase, there is no evidence, like you said, Nicola, as a way to explain away rather than as a flaw together. And so I was wondering what you made of the levels of evidence that many medical guidelines talk about. And I've sent a link through in the group chat as a commonly used example of the levels of evidence. And Nicola, I wondered if you saw if you saw conflict at all of those levels of evidence, or if there was more of a scope for conversation or agreement at some levels more than others.
Yeah, I mean, I can't just look at this right now, but I have seen that sort of thing before. And so I think, yes, as far as I remember, I think that there would be more agreement at different levels at some of those different kinds of evidence. But it's often those different levels of evidence are not very much at the forefront in any kind of clinical encounter, and certainly not in the language around this particular virus. I don't know if that's a fair enough assumption, but yeah. So unless you want to give a summary of those levels of evidence, do you? You're muted, I think.
I think that that's an interesting observation that you make, that that it's that there has been a particular language with this virus that that is not there with other discussions between science and faith, or medicine and faith. The levels of evidence table, just to summarise it for people, is usually presented as a triangle, with right at the top, the pointy end of the triangle being systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and then below that RCTs, and stepping down to 3 different types of observational studies, with the base of the triangle being background information, anecdotes, and expert opinion. And this was partly an attempt to make it clear, of course, that my anecdotal experience is comparable to another person's anecdotal experience, that one can't use expertise, whatever that means, to trump another person's experience. The levels of evidence have been criticised for their implied hierarchy, or putting systematic reviews at the top of the tree, because does that actually answer every scientific question? And it certainly doesn't answer every medical question.
Yeah, no, that's really good, thank you. And but I think if there was more of that emphasis on the different kinds of evidence, which is what I'm trying to argue for, really, that would be very helpful. I found my mother has just gone into nursing home care, and I found that there was a big difference between the doctors in the public hospital, who kept saying to me there is no evidence for such and such. But once she got into the private hospital, which was mostly run by Filipino nurses, they had a very different attitude and seemingly a much wider understanding of evidence and a willingness to sort of be more flexible, which I thought was very interesting, probably coming out of a different sort of training system.
That's great. I think that's all that's all the questions we have at that point. But yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So following on from this problem, I'm just looking at this from different lenses. Are the contradictions which have been so stark in this epidemic? So as well as trusting double-blind trials, we're also meant to trust scientific authorities. And the public are aware of the contradictions from scientific authorities at the best of times, especially in the area of dietary choices. But the pandemic has brought conflict between confident pronouncements made early and late in the pandemic into relief. And conflict between authorities is also obvious. And public policy and public announcements, all backed by science, have changed and contradicted one another with enormous rapidity. So, for example, in the recent crisis, there have been too many confident pronouncements about how masks don't work, at least in some countries. So again, there is no evidence has been the catch cry, even though the inductive evidence on the ground from Asia was pretty substantial, and the weight of evidence is now in their favor. So while Asians all dutifully don their masks at the first sign of a virus, including their leaders, mask use has become something of a high-stakes drama in the US, for instance. And medical workers all over the world have given first-person testimony that they cannot get hold of PPE, and infection rates among medical workers were rising, while authorities kept repeating that there is plenty of equipment and that the guidelines are adequate. And this happened even in New Zealand at Waitakere Hospital and in other jurisdictions around the world. And at first we were told in almost all countries that hand washing would save us from the virus. We were touching our eyes too often. It is now thought to be much less important relative to mask wearing and social distancing, and scientists are now openly wondering whether this early advice didn't help the virus spread. So moreover, negative testing is thought to confer some sort of seal of purity, but we know now that possibly 2/3 of the population is asymptomatic, and the test gives a false negative as often as 30% of the time. when someone is really positive. And we know that up to 2/3 of people might have no symptoms but possibly spread the virus. The problem of evidence has been exacerbated in recent months then by the lack of facticity in the pronouncements of politicians and by implication the scientists advising them. The British public, for instance, were told repeatedly things that turned out not to be true. Most importantly, they were told that the virus could be taken on the chin, but that their care homes were being protected, while the truth was that there was a little PE. Sick people were being moved into care establishments and deaths in care homes were not being counted. The only care homes which avoided the crisis were ones in which the managers ignored the official advice. The Brits were being told in March that big events like football matches and festivals had a very minimal extra risk of infection above ordinary everyday life, and events like these are now thought to be responsible for super spreading of disease. President Trump said that there would be no virus in America. It would be gone in no time, but there are now over 200,000 deaths. He later claimed he was doing that to stem panic, but of course we know what happened next. And one is left wondering whether a slightly more holistic, more common sense approach, one which took inwardness and personal experience into account, would not have led to better results. None of these contradictions, coming as they do within a very concentrated period of time, is good for the authority of science. And even in New Zealand, our politicians followed the science and it worked. And I would say in a biased way that Jacinda Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield did mostly hit a note of being firm, but though even they kept using the phrase, there is no evidence. But there was a blend of determination and humility not seen in many other places. Even in New Zealand, though, there was a worrying coalition of alternative scientists, one of whom at least was a Christian, who were saying, don't lock down, don't close the borders, live with the virus. More lives will be lost by locking down and ruining the economy than will be lost to the virus if we don't. So similar arguments have been made wherever lockdowns have happened. And I'm sure you have seen them in Australia and even Britain, with its devastating record, keeps looking longingly to Sweden as though their problems would simply disappear. And a new version of this is coming out from the Great Barrington Declaration in England, arguing for a policy of herd immunity among the young. So official advisors don't agree either. And none of this will be good for the authority of science or of public health officials. And perhaps a better approach would always have been to include a range of evidences and to be more humble about what we do know and so on. And then the third section is I want to look a bit more closely at this eclipsing then of ordinary experience. So you can see that all of these lenses actually overlap. So ironically, at a time when scientists are combining together to solve a human problem quickly and in some ways are doing really well, ordinary people often feel unheard by their public authorities and distrust in science increases. This is particularly true for minority religious groups. In New Zealand, you probably have heard that a tragic escalation of the virus came out of a skeptical fundamentalist group in Auckland. A worse crisis was avoided only by some very wise intervention by authorities who refused to clamp down punitively, but instead sent in the head of police with his Bible. This crisis did, however, highlight that even in our countries, there are groups that feel so alienated from the whole that they have a blanket distrust of all scientific and political statements. And a part of the problem with the authority of science is that it is understood to be recognizing only a very limited range of evidence and that it is discounting experience. Because along with double-blind trials and an awareness of the placebo effect has come an official distrust of ordinary experience. The individual's experience can always be explained away. We hear that phrase so often, and it is the official evidence-based check on almost anything we can report from our own experience, unless that experience happens often enough to flick the results over some magical statistical p-level. And yet, as highly relational creatures, we can tell if people are discounting our experience, and it makes us less inclined to trust that authority. thousands of people have died in care homes. Thousands have died at home of COVID-19 in Britain and the US and in other non-functioning jurisdictions, and have been uncounted and unattended. So this level of not listening and not counting will not help the nuanced conversations we need around evidence and science, and how all of this relates to something as equally messy and relational as faith. Serious newspapers, in contrast, have recently increased their attention to the individual's narrative in both disease and in the midst of crises of national and world importance. For instance, the New York Times, which has been attempting to sample and tell the story of ordinary people and young medical workers who have died of coronavirus, or those who are still suffering from long COVID syndrome. They keep trying to make 200,000 who have died in the US, or the almost 50,000 in Britain, more than statistics, which they so easily become. But the lack of attention to ordinary experience cannot explain conspiracy theories, but it must contribute to these. I was speaking to a Maori priest in South Auckland the other day, and he reported widespread skepticism about science in his parishes and widespread vaccination avoidance. This is in part due to the perceived gap with Pākehā culture. But science in its single-mindedness has also run the risk of being identified with only a white power base. So at a time when science is under attack, and when subjectivity is most under threat, well, actually, I'll stop there. This is the last bit. So I'll just sort of stop there and ask whether anyone has any comments or questions again right now.
Okay, Robert, would you like to unmute? Is this the end of your presentation?
No, I have a bit more to go.
Okay, I just wanted to know whether to open it up for everyone to reveal themselves. Yeah, I'll just hand it over to you, Robert.
Thanks. It's just, you seem to be saying already, in essence, that even strong evidence, as it were, in a different motivational context, can have a very negative effect, such as protecting oneself from litigation or looking for political scoring. And so really the preferable mode of examining evidence perhaps would be to look at the spirit in which it's presented, and then discern that, which we're told to do in scripture anyway. And even if it's mathematical, it can be twisted, so to speak. That's the essence of what I'm trying to present to yourself from the group.
Yes, I think there are lots of people though working within a system which is excluding of subjectivity, so that the spirit in which the individual might be working is quite legitimate and quite good, but the system in which they're working is necessarily precluding of any kind of subjectivity. So I don't think it's always just, it doesn't always work to just sort of say, let's look at the spirit, although I agree that the spirit is important. But many medical encounters occur in very tense and very rushed and often very difficult circumstances, you know, leaning against a wall in a corridor or whatever. And it's not always very easy to do that kind of discernment in those circumstances. So I think I'm not really talking about individuals so much as I'm talking about the way in which authorities and politicians and medical science is constrained by the various understandings of what is evidence. And does that make sense? So it's not, I mean, obviously the individual matters as well, but
yes, I'm thinking
limits
also
to what the individual can do in a system that is constrained in that way.
yes, I suppose I'm including the spirit of a system as well.
Yes,
including even a profession or a discipline or even a school in a certain area. Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, no, sure, yeah.
Has anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question at this point? There isn't anything written in the chat. Okay, I'll just ask you to move on, I guess, Nicola.
Yeah, that's fine. So I just want to end by having a bit more of a look at the way in which science and faith might combine. So at a time when science is under attack and when subjectivity is most under threat, I want to look at how science and faith have come closer in the past. Many think about how we can think about science and faith together. Most famously, Michael Polanyi talked about the way in which all knowledge was personal and about frameworks and communities of conviviality. And so in his world, scientists would be aware of this at all times and would be aware of the personal aspect of their science endeavors or medical endeavors. Tom McLeish in Faith and Wisdom in Science, a much more recent book, has explained how science began as nature and natural philosophy. And of course, that was what was happening in Boston when somebody sort of said, look, this is how we deal with smallpox in other parts of the world. But McLeish gives the example of Macrina, who was the brother of Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, who entertains her dying brother by talking about how we can know that an empty bottle is not really a bottle and not really empty. One is only to observe it under the water, she says, to see that it doesn't fill immediately, and then when it does, bubbles emerge. So that kind of observation of nature was key to so much early science and was sometimes motivated as much by questions of faith as by science, and in this case around the soul or the mind. That science is now done by teams of high tech and is data driven, not so often done by careful observation of the natural world. So after all, one of the problems is that we cannot see the virus and people fall sick one by one and sometimes they die, and it's hard to see all of that. Science only counts some very prescribed results as evidence. It relies heavily on statistics which are inaccessible to many people, and sometimes they're also counterintuitive. So this virus is particularly sneaky, as they say. It is just benign enough that it can be denied, even by the leader of the free world apparently suffering from it. But it is lethal enough to be destroying our way of life, whether we lock down or we don't lock down. And as someone said, even the prospect of a vaccine is not giving us very much relief at the moment, or much hope. But in the midst of all this hard data, softer questions are lost, like what does it all mean, and why is it here, and does it collectively mean anything at all? And what is the virus doing to our lives and our corporate cultures? And the gap between meaning and science has increased. And what is also lost is the bigger picture. A recent World Health Organization statement advised that countries should not tackle the virus with science alone, which is interesting. In Germany, for instance, theologians, philosophers, psychologists are also advising the government, along with scientists, on how to best deal with the pandemic. And as well as involving people from more other disciplines, science could admit more uncertainty. We can ponder what would it mean if science were not to discount human experience, if it were to go back to its roots and emphasize observation, pattern recognition, and imagination in the overall scientific enterprise. What would the world be like if we were to admit evidence more often into scientific discourse? An interesting example of doing science slightly differently is in the book Entangled Web of Life by Merlin Sheldrake. Not only does he attempt to give a big picture of life on Earth and its dependence on fungi, in which he does a huge amount of very thorough scientific fieldwork. But he also took, which was examining the role of psilocybin on imagination and problem solving in scientists. In other words, he got high on magic extract, and then he observed whether that helped with his scientific thinking. Now this is a bit of an extension from sleeping on it. But of course it did work in the sense that he was able to have a much more holistic view of his problems after taking the drug than before. And because science is becoming less and less cognizant of the ordinary subjectivity, the same then applies to theology also. Theology is always attempting to be more and more like science. And the theologian Wenzel van Hoosten warns against doing theology this way when he says, it is important that theologians realize that they are authentically involved in their pursuit, not only when approaching their field of study critically, but also when they realize that critical thought does not demand cutting themselves off from their basic convictions and ultimate commitment to a supposed objectivity. Creativity and rationality in a fundamental theological reflection on systematic theology can never mean abandoning the sources and traditions of theology. They imply rather the construction of a model in which the extremes of the content of the Christian faith on the one hand and the context of the problems of the engaging philosophy of science on the other are transcended in a new and creative conceptual transformation. And of course, I'm not at all saying that ordinary experience, as I think someone phrased, should always be the final arbiter. We know as a species that we take on threats and that we are very unused to dealing with global or long-term threats, which is why climate change is so difficult. And as the Bible tells us, we are often blind. We have to walk the fine line, taking ordinary experience and observation into account while nevertheless being guided by the science and recognizing that science has a role to play in overcoming our blindness if it does not go beyond its reach. So to summarize, science has excelled in recent months. We have staggering knowledge of the coronavirus, but at the same time, the public health announcements in many jurisdictions have been so contradictory that the authority of science is under threat. And science has become too rigid in its understanding of evidence and is in danger of losing public trust. The pandemic has magnified those problems. But it is as religious people, as Van Hoosten says, that we have another aspect to this problem of evidence. What we believe, most of us, seems just as incredible to the average person on the street as the conspiracy theories we all decry. The languages of faith and science are becoming more and more resistant to each other. A man who lived 2,000 years ago claims to be, or is claimed by his followers, to be the incarnation of the Creator God, the wisdom spirit known by all people groups. And his death at the hands of the Romans is considered to be saving for all people and perhaps the whole cosmos. He endures after his death, and with him all Christians and perhaps all people and all life also endures. Really, that is much more unbelievable to most secular people than any conspiracy theory. Moreover, the prophetic voice has always been counter-authoritarian and counter-establishment. So we want people to be sensible, most of us, most of the time, when it comes to hard evidence and data, but to be quite edgy when it comes to morality and social organization, ritual, the reality of prayer, and supernatural elements. So as scientists of faith, we might want people to listen to their religious experience, because it is experience, that chastening, enlightening, and sometimes luminous experience, that brings us to faith, and that affirms our inner longings, that goes beyond the but that becomes harder and harder to do when science becomes so single-minded. So scientists, I think, should feel some conflict, not just about a few propositions, but about these contrasting ways of knowing. Scientists are in danger of losing people because their experience is not recognized. And as scientists of faith, we should also recognize that faith comes in a variety of experiences, and that the pandemic has magnified many of these tensions. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm just going to ask Chris if he'd like to ask his question.
Sure, I could ask.
But you know what? Oh,
one there from Charles. Why don't we let Charles have a go?
Okay. And can I get people, if they are willing, I should say, to put on their cameras so that we can see everybody? Just sort of gives us that bit of a nicer feeling that we're all together. And just, yeah, take off your mute button, and then you can go ahead, Charles.
Thank you. You can hear me all right.
Yes.
My question then is about Nico's comment about the rigidity of scientists. And my question is that because they believe that their science is based on objective facts only, and they're trying to deny that there's a lot of faith in the very basis of science and in the scientific method and in how you then deal with experiments and results of them?
Yes, I would say that is the case. I think if we go back to the beginning, to the Marilyn Robinson quote, she says it's hard for people. That's because subjectivity keeps pushing through, but that we keep trying to be more and more objective. And I think, and increasingly in this world also, objectivity or science is seen as in contrast to faith. So, yes, I think there is more and more of a push to attempt to be objective. Yeah. I don't know whether that answers your comment or not, but I would agree with it, I think.
Hey.
Okay. No, thank you.
Great.
Do you want to elaborate more, Charles?
No, I've had other thoughts on really different tangents. So I've had my turn.
Okay.
I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Okay, I can see that there's somebody here that by the name of G.R. McLean. I'm not sure of your Christian name. Chris, maybe will probably know. Graham, sorry.
Graham,
Just
and he's a philosopher, so he will bring some enlightenment, no doubt. Go ahead, Graham.
Thank you very much. Nicola, thank you for a fascinating and I think very important talk. I don't disagree with you about any of the particular points you're making about the need to take all kinds of evidence, including personal evidence, evidence from our everyday life, and so on, very seriously. I think all that's very helpful. But you've said a number of times that you think the general thrust of the solution you're aiming at is a recovery or a re-emphasis on subjectivity and inwardness. I'm never sure quite what those words mean, but I'm disquieted by the suggestion that that's where the solution lies, because it seems to me that that's as much problem as solution. And this is a very inchoate and unprepared suggestion, but can I try out a thought which might gesture in the direction I'm worried about? Just last night on the ABC TV, one of our Australian journalists was interviewing one of the adoring Trump supporters outside the hospital where he had been, and asked her this question. He said to her, "Do you believe in the coronavirus?" Now, I thought that was an extraordinary question to ask, but she said adamantly and immediately, "Absolutely not," she said. And didn't hear an explanation of why, but she was one of many who would have testified that she doesn't believe in this thing. And we could surmise what was going on there, but it struck me immediately that I often have a similar reaction when I hear people ask their opinion about, say, climate change. Do you believe in climate change? And they give different answers. And I think to myself, if I were ever asked that question, I think I would say, actually, that question is not something for me to believe an answer to or not to believe an answer to. It's a question for the scientists. I'm not a scientist, and I don't have the authority to pronounce upon that question. Similarly, the question of the coronavirus, that's a question for the medical scientists. I don't have the authority to pronounce upon whether there's such a thing. They do. And it's my job to listen to what they say. Now, the very fact that people are asked, do you believe this? And it's regarded as a perfectly legitimate thing for them to have a view on, a view to be placed in comparison to anybody else's, whatever their authority or lack of authority, suggests to me that subjectivity has become imperialistically dominant in a really dangerous kind of way, that everybody's subjective or inward view matters as much as anyone else's. There's all sorts of questions on which that's just wrong, and that the right answer to that is that every one of us, whether we're in science or in ordinary life, need to be approaching things with, one, a proper recognition of our own inadequacy and limitation, therefore a proper humility before the relevant kinds of evidence, including the evidence that only authorities can provide, and recognising each other's contribution. And that's a more important diagnosis of what's going on than to say, bring in subjectivity. You see what I'm getting at, that I think in some respects...
No, I understand it, and I agree with that. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I wouldn't necessarily call it subjectivity, I suppose, but I feel a similar despair when young students say they don't believe in evolution also.
Yeah,
because I think,
that's right.
I mean, you can't just...
That's right.
You can't just not believe. I might be overstating it. I do want science to be an authority, but I mean, up to a point. I do think that it is a certain sort of corrective of certain kinds of madness. And so, yes, I would agree with that. And I'm not at all wanting to abolish it. The results of science over here are going to be contradicted by someone's craziness over there. It's more, for instance, I mean, this is another, and so I think we have to have both and, you know, like in animal studies, for example, for a very long time, it was assumed that there was no real personality or subjectivity in animals. And it was someone like Jane Goodall who actually persuaded, you know, animal scientists that they really did have personality and we had to accept their subjectivity. And yet, and that was a huge victory that she had. And but the science wasn't any less science. It was just that it was done taking certain sorts of subjectivity into consideration. Does that make sense? So that's the kind of thing that I want to I want to say science should be able to accept that kind of subjectivity, not that it should be just ignored or that it should be discarded and someone's inadequate and ignorant opinion should be worth as much as that. So I mean, I think that's a very good question, and I would agree with that. And I feel a similar despair, as I say, when people say they don't believe in climate change or they don't believe in evolution.
Yeah. Well, may I just say thank you. I think that's very helpful. And if I may suggest that as the discussion is pursued, we be careful about what we mean by subjectivity.
Yeah, sure. No, I agree. Yeah.
Drawing appropriate distinctions there. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Peter to unmute himself and ask his question to Nicola, or questions, I think.
That's me, is it?
Peter Fagg.
Peter Fagg.
No,
sorry.
right. Okay.
Yeah, on the chat, I'm down as me. I don't know how I've missed my name out there, but thanks, Nicola. A lot to think about there. I've posed the question that was probably a bit off what we're looking at tonight, but should we blame God for creating deadly viruses, or why has God created such viruses that are deadly to humans, given that we accept that God is the creator? Christians accept that. Presumably he has created deadly viruses, and so how do we How do we accept that? Is that good or not?
That, I mean, it is slightly off topic, but that's fine. I mean, but that's exactly the kind of thing I think is raised by this pandemic, and it is the kind of question that I think people of faith really want to ask, and that it is the kind of question also that can be eclipsed by some of the hard data. And so, of course, you will not be surprised that I don't have the answer to this, but I do think that there are all sorts of things that are very interesting, and I think people have raised these issues, you know, that perhaps if it is a pangolin virus, it was never meant to be in our habitat, and that we've forced it to be in our habitat is one of the answers. So that,
yeah,
you know, the way in which we're interacting with animals, it may well be a critique of that. It may be, well, it's possible we're in the season of creation, that you can talk about the natural world being in judgment on us. I mean, there's all sorts of theological approaches that you can take to this, and I think they're very important questions. I mean, the other side of that, I think, is that we now know that 50% of human and other mammalian, and perhaps the DNA of all life is viral, and that viruses play an important role in the evolution of life on Earth, and so they have this magnificent role as well as being deadly at times. And you know, I think in my book on animal suffering, I talked about the fact that we can see the whole natural world as a sense of an extension of the parable of the wheat and the tares, and that, you know, the good aspects of something are very closely entwined with the more problematic aspects of it. Tangle them in this current age. But I think there's an awful lot could be said about that, yes. And those are the questions of meaning that are so urgent, I think, to approach in this time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Next we'll have Rob and Jen Davis. One or both of you can unmute.
Hi, it's Jen here. Thank you for the conversation, Nicola. And I used to work in public health, I'm a microbiologist, so I've got a huge amount of sympathy for the scientists and medical staff involved. And I guess my question was, doesn't social media inhibit considered and thoughtful discussion? You talked before about how people don't trust scientists because there's all these different messages coming out, but surely that's exaggerated and encouraged by the fact that there's reporters wanting around. I mean, conflict between two scientists is absolute goldmine for any keen young reporter.
Oh yeah, I think social media has a lot to answer for, yes. And I think people are beginning to see that, although how it can be curbed or stopped, of course, is another huge social issue. But I think the things that I have been talking about are all out there in the, you know, I mean, the fact that there are contradictions coming out from public authorities through normal news media. I mean, it's not misreporting that's getting these contradictions. It's actually, you know, the reporting of what's actually being said that raises these contradictions. So once you get into this whole social media, you come across all of these sort of unfettered conspiracy theories, which only add to the discord. So yes, I think social media adds a whole other level of problematic another problematic dimension to all of this that I haven't even looked at. But yeah, I agree. Thanks.
Yeah, I've noticed that the conspiracy theorist is no longer just the nutter down the street. It's educated people, well-informed people.
Yes, exactly.
That's the thing that's really I've noticed has changed. Yeah. Anthony, could you unmute and...
Hello, thanks very much for the talk. I found it very interesting, and particularly as the fact that we as Christians seem to be using what we call generalist words to describe things which we might not necessarily agree with completely. I mean, for instance, talking about evolution. Evolution is a theory, and if you take it to its ultimate, it means that everything happens accidentally because of the survival of the fittest. But in actual fact, and that's probably, it's been accepted so widely and probably amongst a lot of Christians, so that effectively we often downplay what the Bible is saying about issues of creation. I must admit I was in that sort of school up until quite recently, but latterly I've been reading a lot of work by Hugh Ross, and he has his organisation has a theory called Old Creation Theistic Model. And I must admit, from the point of view of the universe and also from the point of view of life on Earth, there's a lot in that which makes a lot of sense, and all of that makes sense in the sense that God is the creator at each point in this movement, rather than it all happening by possible accident. I don't know whether you've got any comments on that, because this issue of and when you're talking about the virus, I mean, I think you were right in saying that the virus, when it was in its normal setting, was probably an important part of life anyway. And it's just that we have sidetracked it into affecting humans, and therefore created a problem for ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not absolutely sure what the question was, but I think that I would say about evolution, that evolutionary theories have changed an awful lot in the last 50 years, and that it's, you know, the whole idea that evolution is in fact, you know, cooperative as much as it is competitive, that that it's constrained, so that there are random elements of it. The constraints are just as important as the random elements. All of that makes a very different conversation with theology, and so I wouldn't characterize evolution in quite the. I think I would want to sort of interact with people like Simon Conway Morris and many other biologists who are sort of rewriting the conversation between theology and biology in the present day. Yes, I agree with this point also, yeah, about the virus, yes.
Well, I agree that that's a good thing.
Which means I think that it's much easier to see this, I mean, I think it's a very big and a very important theological issue. Evolution, how does it fit with the whole idea of a providential and creative God? I think that's very, very important. But I do think the conversation these days is much easier than it was perhaps in the middle of the 20th century. And because of these other ways in which evolutionary theory has changed, and that we're seeing aspects of it that were not visible before, I think.
Maybe we should be doing more to encourage this conversation, because my feeling is that very few Christians talk about it, or they're scared to talk about it because they might be challenged.
No, I think you're right about that.
Christians.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. You have creationists on the one hand and people like most of my fellow Anglicans on the other who just don't think it's a very interesting problem. So, yes.
I'll ask Ian Parker to unmute.
Yes, we talk about how objective is science, but is it a different issue, the accuracy? Because when we make scientific observations, there's no guarantee that our observations are 100% accurate. And then when we're developing theories from those observations, we are even more likely to make some errors of judgment.
Yes, that's true. But I think that's what science, I mean, that's what the scientific method is always trying to deal with, isn't it? The fact that, I mean, by having very good definitions of variables and things like that. But yes, I think human life is so complex and so infinitely deep that it's always hard to constrain our experimentation in such a way that it comes up with answers that do reflect the real life. Yes, but that's what science is doing, and to a large extent, I think it is successful. But there is a lot of opportunity, of course, also for fraud, and there's also a lot of opportunity for just handling of the evidence. All those sorts of things are increasingly possible, I think.
Great. Peter's going to ask a question, but he's just pointed out something that Chris and I have just realised, that those of you who have come from other parts of Australia may have tuned in late. And I apologise for that. I should have reminded you in an email. But, however, there is a recording of tonight's session and it will be up tomorrow on the ISCAST website. So, but again, I am sorry about that. Peter, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Well, it wasn't so much that I had a question to ask as that when you called Peter, I thought, what is that? Is that me? I'm interested in what you said about the spread of what you call conspiracy theories into a broader and broader area of the public. I suppose Chris might consider me a conspiracy theorist, because I don't give credence to any theory of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, which is not to say I don't believe that warming occurs. Also, incidentally, when we're talking about the issues raised by authority, and again, I have to apologise, I missed an hour of this discussion. In issues when it comes to the authority of science and COVID, we are in a situation at the moment where there is an extraordinary variation of scientific opinion about this virus. For those who want to, on the 10th of September, CDC put out its best estimates of the infection mortality rate for various age ranges for COVID, and they were shockingly little. And yet we have a situation in Victoria. Chris is in Victoria. I don't know where you are, so he could tell us about what life is like under a complete lockdown. And the lockdown is supposedly justified by the science, and yet somewhere like Sweden, the science justified not looking down. In those circumstances, the use of science for highly political and issues which really should be political does nothing but erode the status of science. And it seems to me that's happening in more and more areas where scientists are buying into things that they really should steer clear of if they want to preserve any kind of respect for them as disinterested inquirers. So that's all.
I did mention the fact that there were these very different interpretations, yes, of the coronavirus, and we have that in New Zealand. We have a minority group of very vocal scientists who have argued very strongly against any kind of lockdown. I think there's all sorts of things can be said about that, but I agree that having such different scientific opinions about that doesn't help the authority of science. But on the other hand, I do think that in a crisis like this, politicians have to rely on science, and scientists have to have some opinions about what should be done. So we are in a very difficult sort of situation. I mean, there's partly a difference of opinion amongst scientists, of course, because we only know so much so far. But you know, I think that over 6,000 deaths in Sweden is not insignificant when you're trying to compare those sorts of things. But the issue really is that there are differences in opinion amongst scientists, and I would agree. And that doesn't help the overall situation of trusting science. Yes, I'd agree with that.
Okay, great. Okay, we've got a few minutes left for some questions because I'd like to finish up with some prayer. Just for a couple more, I think. Steve.
Oh, hi, Nicola. Thank you very much for your talk. Just have a question about evidence itself, which you were talking about. I've always found that evidence has to be assessed in its relevance and the strength, the weight you attach to it. In the context of any decision that's having to be made. In the case of the pandemic, the decisions are generally about lockdown or about treatment or something of that nature. And you require a particular type of evidence for that. Scientific evidence is quite helpful on that sort of thing. And personal evidence or subjective evidence can be relevant as well. If you were making a decision in another type of context, for example, in relation to theology or accepting God, then scientific evidence is less relevant and personal experience becomes more relevant, I think. Do you think that the reliance upon evidence changes depending on the context?
Yes, I think it does. A different way of obtaining evidence, but I don't think that they are completely distinct from each other. And so I think Polanyi was right to emphasize the fact that there is a huge personal element to science, to the most objective science. And he was also right that even in faith, we're always testing it, you know, in some ways. We're not just relying on our latest whim. We're testing it within the community of faith. We're testing it in script, you know, by trying to live out the scriptures and all those sorts of things. So there's a testing which happens in the world of faith, and there's a personal element in the world of science, and they're not completely disjointed from each other. So yes, there's different ways of getting evidence, but there are similarities as well, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Chris Mulheron. I think we can come to your question.
Sure. I was just making a note, which I sent to you, Sarah, but it was actually for everybody. So there it is.
Okay.
Michael Polanyi. Look, I've made my point. My question is, there's also another aspect of science, which is the pursuit, the way science works nowadays. There is this push to publish, and unfortunately, we've seen already 35 academic papers on COVID-19 that have been retracted because of the rush to publish. So obviously, scientists don't help themselves. Some scientists don't help the name of science when that sort of thing happens. So having put it on the chat with a link, I think that's just a comment rather than a question, although Nicola may care to respond.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's not surprising that you would get rushed papers at this stage. But I also, you know, have, I mean, a scientist told me recently that he's given up reviewing because he thinks there's just too much fraud going on in the scientific publishing world, because of course there's so much at stake in terms of publishing as well. So this is just a personal, comment from somebody about the extent of fraud out there, which is interesting. So I think both, you know, being too rushed and also the fact that there is dishonesty going on are both important aspects which can't be overlooked in the whole scientific publishing practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're going to finish it there, the conversation there. I think everyone would agree that it has been a really, really interesting conversation that we've had tonight. And I do again apologise to those people from Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory, who arrived a little late. And that's another reason why you should turn to daylight saving. So I'm just going to ask Philippa if she would close in prayer for us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Let's pray. Dear God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, thank you for this world and its splendours and intricacies that bring so much delight. Thank you for the gift of minds, the minds together tonight to tackle the complexities of being your people. And thank you for Nicola and her challenge to us to take all kind of evidence seriously, to ponder the subjective and search for the truth of the issue. Bless Nicola and all here in their work as they seek to honour you in their thinking and actions. May we all contribute to the furthering of your kingdom through Jesus Christ. Amen.